The chalk dust settled in the air like morning mist over Millbrook Valley as 19-year-old Kael Thornwick stepped forward, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he approached the blackboard. The Harvard lecture hall fell silent, a silence so thick you could cut it with a scythe. Professor Hawthorne, the most feared mathematician in Cambridge, stood frozen, his mouth agape as he stared at the elegant solutions sprawled across the board in Kael's crude handwriting. "Impossible," Hawthorne whispered, his voice cracking like autumn leaves. But this story doesn't begin with triumph. No, this story begins 6 months earlier, in a place where the closest thing to higher mathematics was calculating fertilizer ratios and counting potato yields. This is the story of how a farmer's son from nowhere became the somebody who solved what Harvard's finest minds couldn't. And more importantly, it's about never letting anyone tell you that your dreams are too big for where you come from. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness of Millbrook Valley, like it had every morning for the past 19 years of Kael Thornwick's life. But this morning was different. Today, the letter sat on the kitchen table, the letter that would change everything. Harvard University, full scholarship, applied mathematics. Kael stared at the acceptance letter for the 100th time, his rough fingers tracing the embossed seal. 3 months had passed since he'd sent his application, never really believing it would amount to anything. After all, what did Harvard want with a kid whose highest education came from Millbrook Valley Community High, population 847? "Still can't believe it's real," Ember Blackwood's voice carried across the morning air as she approached the farmhouse porch, 2 steaming cups of coffee in her hands. Her auburn hair caught the first rays of sunlight, and her emerald eyes sparkled with the kind of excitement that only true friends possess when your dreams start coming true. "Feels like a mistake," Kael admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Like they're gonna realize they sent this to the wrong Kael Thornwick." Ember settled beside him on the wooden steps, her shoulder brushing against his. The only mistake would be not going. She paused, studying his profile. "You've been solving mathematical puzzles since we were 12, Kael. Remember when you figured out the optimal planting pattern for your dad's fields, using nothing but graph paper and stubbornness?" Kael smiled, despite his anxiety. "That was different. That was practical." "Mathematics is mathematics," Ember said firmly, "whether you're calculating crop yields or—" she gestured at the letter, "whatever they do at Harvard." The screen door creaked open, and Garrison Thornwick emerged, his weathered face bearing the kind of lines that come from decades of sunrise farming and honest work. At 55, Kael's father possessed the quiet strength of a man who'd never needed to prove himself to anyone. Except maybe now, watching his son prepare to enter a world he'd never imagined. "Morning, Ember," Garrison nodded, settling into his worn rocking chair. "Kael showing you that letter again?" "Dad," Kael started. "No shame in being proud, son." Garrison's voice carried the weight of 1,000 conversations they'd never had about dreams and limitations. "Just promise me something." Kael turned to face his father, seeing something vulnerable in those steel-blue eyes. "Promise me you won't let them make you ashamed of where you come from. Harvard's got a way of making folks forget their roots." "But your roots?" Garrison gestured toward the rolling farmland that stretched beyond the horizon. "These roots run deep. They're what'll keep you grounded when those fancy professors try to make you feel small." Ember reached over and squeezed Kael's hand. "Your dad's right. But also remember, you're not going there to fit in. You're going there to show them what they've been missing." 8 weeks later, Kael stood at the gates of Harvard University with a single duffel bag and a heart full of determination that was rapidly being replaced by overwhelming intimidation. Cambridge buzzed with the energy of intellectual superiority, and everywhere he looked, students moved with the confident stride of those who'd never questioned their right to be there. His dormitory room was smaller than his bedroom back home, but it might as well have been a palace for how foreign it felt. His roommate, Preston Worthington III, had arrived with enough luggage to stock a small department store, and the kind of casual arrogance that comes with generational wealth. "So, you're the scholarship kid from—" Preston consulted a paper. "Millbrook Valley, where exactly is that?" "About 4 hours west," Kael replied, unpacking his few belongings. "It's farming country." "Ah." Preston nodded as if this explained everything. "Well, don't worry. Harvard has an excellent remedial program for students from disadvantaged backgrounds." Kael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Save your energy for what matters," he told himself, hearing his father's voice. The first week passed in a blur of orientation sessions, campus tours, and the growing realization that everyone else seemed to speak a language he was still learning. They discussed philosophy over lattes, debated economic theory like it was sports, and name-dropped professors Kael had never heard of with casual familiarity. But it was in Professor Lysander Hawthorne's advanced mathematical theory class that Kael truly understood the challenge ahead. Professor Hawthorne entered the lecture hall like a storm system, all dramatic sweeps and intimidating presence. At 62, he possessed the kind of academic reputation that made graduate students weep and peers tread carefully. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccably tailored, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than teaching undergraduate students. "Mathematics," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "is not democratic. It does not care about your feelings, your background, or your participation trophies. It is a pure meritocracy where intelligence is the only currency that matters." His eyes swept the room, lingering on each student as if measuring their worth. "Some of you are here because of legacy admissions, some because of athletic scholarships, some because of charitable diversity initiatives." His gaze settled on Kael. "But mathematics will reveal what you truly are. It cannot be faked, bought, or sympathy passed." Kael felt every eye in the room turn toward him, and his cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. "You?" Hawthorne pointed directly at Kael. "State your name and background." "Kael Thornwick. I'm from Millbrook Valley." "And what do your parents do, Mr. Thornwick?" "My father's a farmer." A ripple of barely suppressed laughter ran through the classroom. Hawthorne's smile was sharp as a blade. "A farmer's son? How quaint! Tell me, Mr. Thornwick, what's the most complex mathematical concept you encountered in your rural education?" Kael's hands clenched into fists under his desk. "We covered calculus and basic differential equations." "Basic being the operative word, I'm sure." Hawthorne turned to the board. "Class, this semester we'll be exploring theoretical frameworks that have challenged the greatest minds in mathematical history. Mr. Thornwick, I hope you're prepared for a significant adjustment in difficulty." 3 weeks into the semester, Professor Hawthorne announced what he called the Millennium problem, not one of the famous Clay Institute problems, but his own unsolved equation that had stumped Harvard's mathematics department for over 2 years. "This equation," he said, filling the blackboard with an intricate maze of symbols and variables, "represents a theoretical framework for predicting optimal resource distribution in complex systems. Our finest graduate students have attempted solutions. Visiting professors from MIT and Princeton have tried. All have failed." The equation looked like abstract art to most of the class, beautiful in its complexity but utterly incomprehensible. Kael stared at it, something familiar nagging at the back of his mind. "I'm offering extra credit to anyone who can provide even a partial solution," Hawthorne continued, "though I suspect this class lacks the intellectual capacity to meaningfully engage with such advanced concepts." Again his eyes found Kael. "Perhaps our agricultural friend would like to take a stab at it? After all, farmers are accustomed to dealing with distribution problems. How many seeds per acre, that sort of thing." The class erupted in laughter. Kael felt his face burn, but something else stirred within him, a recognition he couldn't quite place. That night, he called Ember from his dorm room, needing to hear a friendly voice. "It sounds like a complete jackass," Ember said bluntly after Kael recounted the day's humiliation. He's not wrong, though, Kael sighed. Everyone here is so much smarter than me. They've had tutors and prep courses and... Stop. Ember's voice cut through his self-pity. Remember in 10th grade when Mrs. Patterson said you'd never understand advanced mathematics because you were more suited to manual labor? Kael smiled despite himself. And then I won the state mathematics competition. Exactly. And what did you tell me that day? That just because someone has a fancy title doesn't mean they understand everything. Kael Thornwick, you are the smartest person I know. Different doesn't mean inferior. Maybe your brain works in ways theirs don't. Maybe that's exactly what this problem needs. After hanging up, Kael found himself returning to the equation. He copied it into his notebook and carried it everywhere, to meals, to other classes, even to the small job he'd taken washing dishes in the campus cafeteria to help cover expenses. For weeks, Kael attacked the problem from every angle he'd learned. Traditional calculus approaches led nowhere. Matrix theories crumbled under the equation's complexity. Every path seemed to end in mathematical dead ends. It was during a particularly difficult night in the library that breakthrough began to emerge. Not from advanced mathematical theory, but from a memory of home. Kael was exhausted, having spent 6 hours staring at the same variables, when his mind wandered to his father's potato fields. Garrison had always been meticulous about crop rotation, explaining how different nutrients needed to be distributed across the soil in specific patterns to maximize yield over multiple seasons. It's not just about this year's harvest, his father had said one spring morning as they planned the planting. You've got to think 3-4 years ahead, what the soil needs, what it can give, how each decision affects the whole system. Suddenly, Kael saw it. The equation wasn't just about optimal distribution. It was about cyclic optimization over time. The variables weren't static. They were part of a rotating system, like crop rotation, where each cycle affected the next. He began approaching the problem not as a single equation to solve, but as a series of interconnected cycles that influenced each other. He thought about how his father planned irrigation not just where water was needed most now, but where it would be needed as the season progressed, how early watering affected later growth patterns. The breakthrough came at 3:47 IME on a Thursday. Kael was alone in the library, surrounded by crumpled papers and empty coffee cups, when the solution suddenly crystallized. The variables weren't fighting each other. They were dancing, rotating through positions like crops through fields, each taking turns supporting and being supported by the system. His hands shook as he worked through the solution, checking and double-checking each step. By dawn he had it, a complete, elegant solution that accounted for the temporal cycling that everyone else had missed. But having the solution and presenting it were two different challenges entirely. The next morning, Kael sat outside Professor Hawthorne's office, the solution burning in his notebook like a secret too big to contain. Students passed by, some offering sympathetic looks. Word had spread about Hawthorne's particular disdain for the charity case from farm country. "Mr. Thornwick," Hawthorne's voice carried through the office door. "If you're here to discuss dropping the class, I assure you there's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Kael entered the office, noting the walls lined with awards, diplomas, and photographs of Hawthorne with various academic luminaries. The professor sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never being wrong about anything that mattered. "Actually, Professor, I'm here about the Millennium problem." Hawthorne's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? Having trouble with the basic concepts? I can recommend some remedial texts that might help you understand why it's beyond your current level." Solved it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Hawthorne's expression shifted from condescending amusement to mild irritation. "I beg your pardon?" Kael opened his notebook, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The equation you presented." I found a solution. Mr. Thornwick, Hawthorne's voice took on a patronizing tone. This equation has defeated some of the finest mathematical minds in the country. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but... The problem isn't with the equation itself, Kael interrupted, his nervousness giving way to conviction. It's with how everyone's been approaching it. You've all been treating it as static, but it's cyclical. The variables rotate through positions over time, like crop rotation. Hawthorne's smile was sharp with mockery. Crop rotation? Mr. Thornwick, this is advanced mathematical theory, not agricultural science. May I show you? For a moment, Hawthorne seemed about to dismiss him entirely. Then, perhaps out of curiosity or the desire to deliver a more thorough humiliation, he gestured toward the whiteboard. By all means, enlighten us with your agricultural mathematics. Kael moved to the board, his hands steady now. He began writing, explaining each step not in the elevated language of academic mathematics, but in the practical terms that made sense to him. See, if you think of these variables as nutrients in soil, he said, working through the first transformation, they can't all be in the same place at the same time. They have to cycle through positions, each supporting the others at different stages. Hawthorne's expression shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching interest as Kael continued. The temporal aspect everyone's been missing. It's not a bug in the equation, it's the feature. The system optimizes itself over multiple cycles, not just in a single moment. As Kael worked through the solution, mapping each variable's rotation through the system, Hawthorne rose from his chair and moved closer to the board. The mockery in his expression had been replaced by intense focus. This can't be right, Hawthorne muttered, but he was reaching for his calculator, checking Kael's work. The beautiful part, Kael continued, gaining confidence, is that once you recognize the pattern, the optimization becomes predictable. You can forecast resource needs 3-4 cycles in advance, just like my dad planning crop rotations. The room fell silent, except for the rapid clicking of Hawthorne's calculator. Kael watched as the professor's face went through a progression of emotions. Disbelief, verification, shock, and finally something that might have been respect. My God, Hawthorne whispered, it works. It actually works. Word spread through the mathematics department like wildfire. By afternoon, Kael found himself in a conference room filled with professors, graduate students, and department heads, all staring at his solution on the projection screen. Dr. Margaret Chen, the department head, spoke first. Mr. Thornwick, this is remarkable work. The cycling optimization approach, it's so obvious once you see it, but none of us thought to look at the problem from this angle. It wasn't obvious to me either, Kael admitted. Not until I stopped trying to think like a mathematician and started thinking like a farmer. Professor Hawthorne, who had been unusually quiet during the presentation, finally spoke. Mr. Thornwick, I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies, in fact. The room fell silent. In the 3 decades he'd been at Harvard, no one could remember Hawthorne apologizing to anyone, let alone a student. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your background, Hawthorne continued, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. I was wrong. Profoundly wrong. Your solution doesn't just solve the equation, it reveals an entirely new approach to optimization theory. Dr. Chen nodded. We'd like to discuss publishing this work, Mr. Thornwick. With your permission, of course. This could revolutionize how we approach resource distribution problems in economics, logistics, even environmental science. Kael felt dizzy. 6 months ago he'd been worried about whether he belonged at Harvard. Now they were talking about publishing his work in academic journals. There's one condition, Kael said quietly. The room waited. I want to start a scholarship program for students from rural areas, farming communities, places like where I come from, kids who might not look like traditional Harvard material, but have different ways of seeing problems. Dr. Chen smiled. I think that can be arranged." 6 months later, Kael stood once again at the blackboard in Professor Hawthorne's classroom, but this time as a guest lecturer. The equation that had once seemed impossible now served as the foundation for a new field of study that Harvard was calling agricultural mathematics, the application of farming principles to complex mathematical problems. The most important lesson here, Kael told the class of freshmen, many of whom looked as intimidated as he had once felt, isn't about equations or optimization theory. It's about perspective. Every single person in this room sees the world differently because of where you come from, how you grew up, what problems you've had to solve. He looked out at the faces, some confident, some uncertain, all listening. This difference isn't a disadvantage, it's your superpower. The moment you start thinking your background makes you less capable, you've already lost. Mathematics doesn't care if you learn to count using sheep or stock portfolios. Logic doesn't care if your first computer was in a mansion or a community center. After class, as students filed out, Professor Hawthorne approached. "Excellent lecture," he said. "You know, I've been thinking about offering a course on interdisciplinary mathematical approaches. Agricultural applications, as you've demonstrated, but perhaps also culinary mathematics, automotive optimization, even musical theory applications." Kael smiled. "Sounds like you're finally ready to admit that good ideas can come from anywhere." "Indeed." Hawthorne paused. "For what it's worth, you've made me a better teacher. And a better person." That evening, Kael called home. Ember answered on the second ring. "So, how does it feel to be the guy who revolutionized Harvard?" she asked, laughter in her voice. "It feels like the beginning, not the end," Kael replied. "I got an email today from a girl in Montana whose family raises cattle. She solved a logistics problem for the local feed cooperative using principles from my paper. And there's a kid in Iowa who developed a new irrigation optimization system." "The Kael Thornwick effect," Ember said warmly. "The don't underestimate people because of where they come from effect," Kael corrected. "Speaking of which, I have something to ask you. How would you feel about moving to Cambridge? Harvard's offering me a full graduate fellowship, and I could use someone to keep me grounded, someone to remind me where I come from when all this gets to my head." There was a pause, then Ember's delighted laughter filled the phone line. "Kael Thornwick, I thought you'd never ask." Today, the Thornwick Rural Scholars Program has sent over 200 students from farming communities to top universities across the country. They study everything from engineering to medicine to business, bringing perspectives that academia never knew it was missing. Professor Hawthorne, who has become an unlikely champion of diverse educational backgrounds, often tells his colleagues, "The smartest student I ever taught learned mathematics by watching his father plant potatoes." We would do well to remember that intelligence takes many forms. And in Millbrook Valley, Garrison Thornwick still farms his land, but now he also hosts summer mathematics camps for rural students, teaching them that the same logic that governs crop rotation can unlock the mysteries of calculus, that the patience required for farming seasons can solve the most complex equations, and that there's no problem too big for a mind that's learned to see solutions where others see only dirt and seed. The equation that stumped Harvard's finest minds now hangs framed in Kael's old bedroom, a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the simplest perspectives. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who changes everything. 2 years after Kael Thornwick's groundbreaking solution echoed through Harvard's hallowed halls, the academic world was still reeling from what scholars had begun calling the Millbrook Revolution. But the real story wasn't happening in conference rooms or peer-reviewed journals. It was unfolding in places like Dusty Creek, Nebraska, where 16-year-old Zara Nightingale sat in her family's struggling diner, staring at numbers that refused to add up. The Rusty Spoon had been serving truckers and farmers for 3 generations, but lately, the ledger told a story of slow decline. supply costs rising, customer traffic dwindling, and Zara's grandmother, Nona Nightingale, growing more worried with each passing month. The banks had started sending letters with increasingly urgent language, and Zara could see the weight of potential failure pressing down on the woman who had raised her. Thrice she had prayed that Jesus would save her. "These numbers don't make sense, Nona," Zara said, pushing aside her calculus homework to focus on the restaurant's books. "We're hemorrhaging money on inventory that's going bad before we can sell it." Nona adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the diner's windows. At 73, she possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from decades of feeding people. But the mathematics of modern business had become increasingly foreign to her. "I've been running this place the same way my daddy did, and his daddy before him," Nona said wearily. "Order what we need, hope it sells, try to keep the lights on." Zara had been following Kael Thornwick's story obsessively ever since seeing a documentary about rural students changing academia. The Thornwick Rural Scholars Program had become legendary in farming communities, but it was Kael's original breakthrough that fascinated her. The idea that farming principles could solve complex mathematical problems. She wondered if the reverse might also be true. "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" Zara mused, her mind racing. "What if we treated the diner like Dad treats his crop rotation?" Zara's father, Magnus Nightingale, ran one of the most successful farms in 3 counties, not because he had the most land or the fanciest equipment, but because he understood cycles. He planned his plantings 3 seasons ahead, rotating crops to optimize soil health, managing resources to ensure sustainability over time rather than just immediate profit. "Explain that to me like I'm 5, Nona said, settling into the booth across from her granddaughter. Zara grabbed a napkin and started sketching. "Look, Dad doesn't plant the same crop in the same field year after year because it depletes the soil. He rotates. Corn one year, soybeans the next, maybe wheat after that. Each crop gives something to the soil and takes something different." Nona nodded. She'd heard Magnus explain this countless times. "What if we did the same thing with our menu?" Zara continued, excitement building in her voice. "Instead of ordering the same ingredients every week and hoping they sell, what if we planned our offerings in cycles? Heavy comfort foods in winter when truckers want hearty meals. Lighter fare in summer when families travel through. Seasonal specials that use ingredients when they're cheapest and freshest." The concept was simple, but as Zara began working through the mathematics, she realized it was anything but easy. She needed to factor in seasonal price fluctuations, customer traffic patterns, storage limitations, and preparation time. Most importantly, she needed to ensure that each menu cycle supported the next, just like crop rotation. She spent the next week diving into data she'd never thought to analyze before. When did certain ingredients hit their lowest prices? Which months brought the most travelers through their stretch of highway? What were the preparation and storage costs for different types of dishes? The breakthrough came when she started mapping the diner's challenges onto her father's farming philosophy. Magnus always said that the secret wasn't maximizing any single harvest, but optimizing the entire system over multiple seasons. Similarly, the diner's success couldn't be measured week by week, but cycle by cycle. Zara developed what she called the harvest menu model, a rotating system where the diner's offerings changed every 6 weeks, designed to maximize both profit and sustainability. Winter cycles featured hearty stews and roasts that used cheaper cuts of meat and root vegetables. Spring brought fresh salads and lighter fare as produce prices dropped and travelers increased. Summer emphasized quick, portable meals for families on vacation, while fall focused on comfort foods that used preserved and canned ingredients. But the real innovation was in the interconnection. Leftover ingredients from one cycle became featured components in the next. Bones from winter's roasts became stocks for spring soups. Summer's excess vegetables were preserved for fall specials. Nothing was wasted, and each cycle strengthened the foundation for what came next. When Zara presented her model to Nona, complete with financial projections and supply chain optimizations, the older woman stared at the charts and graphs with wonder. "This is what you kids learn in school these days?" Nona asked. "Actually, I learned this from watching Grandpa Magnus," Zara admitted. "I just applied some mathematics to make it more precise." The implementation wasn't without challenges. Longtime customers grumbled when their favorite dishes weren't available year-round. Suppliers needed time to adjust to the new ordering patterns. Staff had to learn new recipes and preparation methods for each cycle. But within 6 months, the results were undeniable. Food waste dropped by 60%. Profit margins increased by 40%. Customer satisfaction actually improved as people began anticipating seasonal specialties and planning trips around favorite menu cycles. Word of the Rusty Spoon's transformation spread through the farming community like wildfire. Other struggling rural businesses began reaching out to Zara, wanting to understand how she'd applied agricultural principles to solve business problems. That's when Dr. Margaret Chen from Harvard called. "Mrs. Nightingale," Dr. Chen said during their video conference, "we've been hearing remarkable things about your work. Would you be interested in presenting your findings at our annual Rural Innovation Symposium?" Zara stared at the screen, hardly believing what she was hearing. "I'm just a high school student who helped save her grandmother's diner." "You're a young woman who identified a novel application of cyclic optimization theory," Dr. Chen corrected gently. "Kael Thornwick's original work opened the door, but you've walked through it and found an entirely new room." 3 months later, Zara stood in the same Harvard lecture hall where Kael had once been humiliated by Professor Hawthorne. But now, the atmosphere was different. Professor Hawthorne himself introduced her, his words carrying none of the condescension that had once marked his interactions with rural students. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hawthorne announced, "I present Ms. Zara Nightingale, who has demonstrated that the principles of agricultural mathematics extend far beyond resource distribution problems and into the realm of business sustainability." Zara's presentation was simple but powerful. She explained how crop rotation principles could revolutionize small business operations, how seasonal thinking could solve supply chain inefficiencies, and how sustainable cycles could replace the boom-bust patterns that destroyed so many rural enterprises. "The beautiful thing about this approach," Zara concluded, "is that it doesn't require expensive technology or advanced education. It requires understanding cycles, thinking sustainably, and recognizing that sometimes the oldest wisdom contains the newest solutions." The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. After her presentation, Kael Thornwick himself approached her. Now a graduate student and rising star in the mathematical community, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. "You know," Kael said, "when I first solved that equation, I thought I was just proving that farm kids could do math. But what you've done, you've shown that agricultural thinking isn't just useful for mathematics, it's a whole different way of approaching problems." "It's funny," Zara replied. "Everyone talks about how rural students need to adapt to academic thinking, but maybe academic thinking needs to adapt to rural wisdom, too." Kael smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping someone would figure out." 6 months later, the harvest menu model had been adopted by over 200 rural businesses across 12 states. Zara had been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, but she'd decided to defer for a year to help implement her system in struggling rural communities. "I want to make sure this reaches the people who need it most before I disappear into academia," she explained to Dr. Chen during one of their regular check-ins. The ripple effects continued to spread. A small-town hardware store in Montana used seasonal inventory cycling to reduce overhead by 50%. A family farm in Ohio applied the model to diversify their crops and create year-round revenue streams. Even a struggling rural hospital in Kansas used cyclic resource management to optimize their staffing and supply costs. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the students themselves. Rural kids across the country began to see their backgrounds not as limitations to overcome, but as perspectives to leverage. Agricultural experience became a source of pride rather than embarrassment. Nona Nightingale, now the proud proprietor of one of Nebraska's most successful diners, kept a photo on her wall from Zara's Harvard presentation. Below it she'd hung a simple, handwritten sign. Sometimes the best innovation is remembering what we already know. As Zara prepared to start her freshman year at Harvard, she received a letter from a 13-year-old boy in rural Alabama whose family was struggling with their small construction business. He'd heard about her work and wondered if cyclic thinking might help with project scheduling and resource management. Zara smiled as she read the letter. The revolution that Kael had started and she had continued was beginning to take on a life of its own. Rural students weren't just going to college to escape their backgrounds anymore. They were going to transform how the world thought about problems. And in Dusty Creek, Nebraska, the Rusty Spoon continued to serve the best rotating menu on Highway 30, proving every day that sometimes the most sophisticated solutions come from the simplest wisdom, and that there's no limit to what young people can achieve when they stop apologizing for where they come from and start celebrating what they bring to the table.